Hello, folks, and welcome to the 2 o'clock panel, The Science in Science Fiction. I am Gideon Marcus of galacticjourney.org, and this is Catharine Asaro, a Nebula-winning and Hugo-nominated author and PhD scientist and just an all-around amazing person. And today we are going to be talking about the relation of science and science fiction. How integrated does science need to be in science fiction for it to be called that? Has science fiction been predictive or cautionary or otherwise accurate at all? And some of our pet peeves and favorite implementations of science in written and visual media, science fiction media. That sound about what you expected, Catherine?
Yes.
Well, then perfect. So when you envisioned this panel, Catherine, did you expect it to be mostly us talking, or did you hope to have audience participation guiding us along, asking us questions?
I'm hoping for both. If people have questions, I hope you will put them in the chat. Let me see if I can get that. So yeah, we have a chat here. Testing. Did people get that?
I'm being told that my name is Lorelei Marcus instead of Gideon Marcus. And
yes, it was last night too.
That's fine. She was there. I'm Gideon Marcus, as you might be able to tell, but it is an honor to be called Lorelei because she is honestly much more amazing than I am.
I figured it was, that you were not Lorelei.
So I will tell you what I do and why I got put on this panel. So the conceit of my thing of galacticjourney.org is we are a bunch of fans who live 55 years ago, day by day, as if it's current. So right now it is September 5th, 1966. Star Trek was just premiered at TriCon yesterday. The Vietnam War is heating up. In fact, next month is going to be the largest draft ever, 49,000 since the Korean War. So we are very much in it. I happen to be a professional space historian. And I contribute a lot of space articles to things. I'm also a science fiction author, and so I know the joy and difficulty of implementing science in science fiction. One of the fun things I wanted to talk about, and I'd love to get Catherine's take on it, especially since she's written so much. Larry Niven is an author that I grew up on, and I've enjoyed a great deal. But one of the funny things about Larry Niven is he would go into the Scientific Americans or the latest Isaac Asimov article and find the coolest current theory and then write a science fiction story incorporating it. So he wrote Neutron Star, for instance, which is going to win the Hugo next year, from my perspective, 54 years ago from yours. And one of the other things, and something we always get a kick out of whenever we read it, is the idea that the Earth has a thin atmosphere in relation to Venus, because we had an oversized moon to strip away 99% of the air, and without it, we would have a thick greenhouse effect causing atmosphere. Now, within about 10 years, it was known that that theory had been discredited. But his known space universe had made it such a plank that it just is in every one of his stories, and hilariously so. So, Catherine, I'd love to know your thought on the idea of chasing the newest trend in science fiction and the perils of becoming dated as a result.
Well, I say this sometimes. We used to have 40 years to be proved wrong. Now we have like 40 minutes because science is developing so fast. Basically, my approach is that, I take science that is well established and then I extrapolate it. And I have fun extrapolating it. And if you do the extrapolation reasonably well, or if you get someone to help you do the extrapolation, if it's not your cup of tea, you generally don't get hit too hard by changes. That's not to say you won't get hit by them like Larry did. And also, it was his Ringworld, I think, right? Was that the one where they wrote and said, no, this is not going to work, so he fixed the science in the next book?
Oh, with the engines, right?
Yeah. I think it's okay. It's more embarrassing that people say, oh, this science is going to be impossible, you can't write about it. And then, 10 years later, people are doing it.
Right.
It's like, I try to say never. I try never to say never say never. Because, if you do something well, if you apply good scientific principles to it, sure. And, that's really hard SF. For softer SF, basically you can just say, I have this drive, Um, I do think if you're going to write the harder, and by hard SF, I'm not just restricting it to chemistry and physics and, mathematical methods, that sort of thing. Even using the psychology or anthropology, those kind of things. I think you should do your research. You should understand it, the field, if you're going to make extrapolation. But once you do, have fun. It's really about how extrapolations in the book as much as about the extrapolations themselves.
I've often used David Brin as my model. It's interesting because he's often labeled as a hard science fiction author, but one of the beautiful things about his Uplift series is that he does not get terribly into the science behind why things work, and as a result, I think they're going to stay current a lot longer. Yeah. I know in my books, I've got hand waves, I've got jump drive, and I've got anti-gravity. But other than that, I try to make the astrophysics accurate as we know it, the planetary science, stuff like that. And part of that's just because I happen to love to teach. So whenever I can get a chance to squeeze science into my YA, I do it.
Well, that's fine. I think if one's going to put science in there, they should try to be accurate about it. But it's perfectly fine to say, I have a sandwich drive. I feed it bologna and it goes fast. Gets me to planets faster than the speed of light. I mean, you can say whatever you want. Or you can actually work through the equations of special relativity and say, well, if this were true, if we made this mathematical change, it would take away the problem with such and such making, giving us a way to circumvent the speed of light. I mean, you can be very mathematical about it. You can be funny, or you can just give it a name and say it does this. My main thought is that if you do decide to take it into more detail, it's nice to get at least, if you can't do the science, if you don't know it, and you shouldn't have to know it, ask someone. And people are always dumping on Star Trek. Like you said, Star Trek just came out. I loved it when it just came out. I had to sneak to watch it because I was supposed to be in bed, So I'd wait till my parents went out and then I'd go watch Star Trek.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say people dump on Star Trek a lot because sometimes their science is pretty wonky, but sometimes they get it right. Like the trouble with tribbles, he got right, right on the nail, the number of, how the tribbles would multiply, and he got all that science right.
So I have to say, we just saw The Cage last night because at the Journey, because we do the thing 55 years ago, and especially with Star Trek, we are being incredibly meticulous. So yesterday was the viewing of The Cage at TriCon. Today we're watching Where No Man Has Gone Before at 4. And by the way, if you'd like to watch with us, just send me your email. I'll be happy to give you the invitation. This goes to Catherine and everybody else watching. And then we're going to watch The Man Trap on Wednesday with commercials. But one of the things
that's real science fiction.
One of the things that impressed me so much about The Cage, I've watched every science fiction thing that has come out in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, in the 50s. So we're talking Forbidden Planet and The Day the Earth Stood Still, just everything. The Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, Doctor Who, although technically I'm not supposed to see that because that's in the UK. And what impressed me so much about The Cage was the fact that they tried to make it scientific. When they go in and they say, this is our spectrographic data, we know what the atmosphere is like based on that. Based on the polarization of the reflection of light from the surface, we can identify metallic structures of this size. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah.
And I argue that Star Trek, the original, was probably the very first real science fiction on television. And in some ways, the hardest stuff that existed, even more than The Next Gen, up until we got, say, first season of Babylon 5. And The Expanse is quite crunchy, too.
Yeah, I enjoy all those. Even when they were wonky in the original Star Trek, like remember that one about I think it was called the Ahura, the one about the rock creature.
The Devil in the Dark, yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, sure, the science of how it moved through rock and stuff was utterly ridiculous. I mean, it's disintegrating these huge tunnels, and where is all the disintegrated rock going, right? And where is it getting all the acid to disintegrate? But they started basically with a good premise, and there's this wonderful scene where Mr. Spock is being pithy, and they're saying, we don't know what's causing this. And Mr. Spock said, well, there is something, and then there's, they do the big Star Trek dun, 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 music that was so wonderfully corny. And then Dr. McCoy says, no, you can't mean silicon or something like that. But then they talk about how silicon, the position of silicon is similar in the periodic table as oxygen. And, and then they bring up some of the problems with it. Like Bones says, no, it wouldn't work. Silicon wouldn't work in an oxygen atmosphere. It's too reactive. It's true. But then they come up with a completely wonky solution.
Sure. They go halfway.
They tried, as a scientist, I give them that. They tried. That makes me very happy.
So I'm going to ask you a question. Let me set it up real quick. I watched the first season of Babylon 5 in the early 90s, and I was so impressed with it because they actually, for the first time, simulated weightlessness in terms of ships would be flying, and to decelerate, they would actually turn around and fire their engines the other way. And I had never seen Newtonian mechanics in a TV show before. I was so impressed. Then we got to third season, and they got the White Star, which was a combination of Minbari and human technology, which sounds like a combination of American and Neanderthal technology. But the thing that bothered me the most was this. So for the first time, they have artificial gravity. In previous shows, they'd shown that they didn't have artificial gravity. If they wanted gravity, they had to do the rotating centrifugal force gravity. Yeah. But now they had artificial gravity. And they had the ability to go 30 Gs with their engine. I'm like, okay, great. Now, here is an opportunity for real science and consistency. If, in fact, they have artificial gravity, they should not do the Star Trek move around in their seats as they turn. There should be nothing. And sure enough, they start going into high-speed maneuvers, and everybody starts doing the Star Trek angle to the side, which is ridiculous, because if you're going 30 Gs, either your artificial gravity works or you are a pancake.
Yeah, exactly. They needed to come up. I mean, what you could say if you wanted to justify it, because I know sometimes Hollywood likes to do things like make noise in space when there would be none, or do this thing, the back and forth, because they think it makes it more exciting. I don't think it actually does. I think science fiction, people who watch science fiction are savvy enough about most of that it's like a little fly in the ointment. But if they would at least come up with some reason, like some sort of stasis coil that protects them from these heavy gravities, but it only works, to a certain limitation, so they can still feel, if they could come up with some justification, it wouldn't be quite so bad.
Interestingly enough, in one of my books, I wanted there to be a little of that, but it's a fundamental plot point and well explained, because I hate inaccuracy in my science fiction. But I have to ask you, as a person who has a zillion credits and is a PhD scientist, what is the level of your credulity? Where is it that you say, no, you know what, you could have tried harder? Where do they do it right? What do they not?
The level of my credulity is not, people can do I have no area that I would say, you can't do this, I will be incredulous. It's how they do it. If they want to go faster in light because the story needs it, they can just say, okay, we have this drive and we're not going to explain how it works, and I'll let them have it because the rest of the story needs it and it doesn't really come into the story much. Or if they say, okay, we have this drive, like Stan Schmidt was really interested in finding ways to circumvent the light barrier, and he wrote some really interesting novels where finding ways that they could go faster than light or circumvent the problems. And Stan is a physicist. I like that too. I mean, either approach is good with me. What I don't like are there's this movie that was so annoyed me. It was actually enjoyable. It was called Category 8, and it was so ridiculous. It was funny, but it was ridiculous for things like, we have all these serious scientists and they want to get funding from the NSF. Well, what do you do if you want funding from the National Science Foundation? In real life, you apply like thousands of other people are applying, right? In this movie, you go to the president and do a demonstration that could possibly destroy the earth, but you're going to take the chance. It's like, what? And of course, this demonstration somehow is going to make the sun explode. Something they did from Earth somehow is going to make the sun explode. And the whole movie was like that. I mean, it was so ridiculous. It was almost fun.
My daughter talked about how the sequel to that movie would be how some storm in the world would be so great that it would knock the moon out of its orbit. And the hilarious thing is now Roland Emmerich is doing that movie. It's called Moonfall. So I guess that's category 9.
Well, category 8 was the sun. The sun was going to blow up.
Oh my God.
So what do you do, right? You're the scientist. No one's listening to you, even though you developed, right, the technology, but they got rid of you because you kept saying this technology is dangerous. So then they find out it actually is exact dead, right? You do, right? In this movie, they try to beat up the science.
Right.
What logical sense does that make? See, that's the kind of thing that pisses me off.
Well, and I have to wonder, now that we've had this pandemic that some of us may have experienced this last year, it used to be that it was totally unrealistic. You would think, my God, people would not be so stupid that they would stare at something so obvious, so scientifically verified. Why is it always one person knows the truth and no one will believe them? And yet now we have a situation where every scientist is saying, whether it's global warming or it's evolution or it's the pandemic, and you still have greater than a 1/6% of the population that always thinks in conspiracy theories. We're at the 30-40% of the world just doesn't believe what's real anymore. That just blows my mind.
Yeah, I think it's a defense mechanism. I think they're scared. I think that's why people are denying it. But denying it's not going to make it any better.
Do you think it's like a future shock, like just a basic conservatism to humanity?
I don't know. It's all wrapped up with politics, and I'm not quite sure I understand the politics. They seem self-defeating. You know, the people who follow that politics are endangering themselves. You know, it's like, oh, follow this. You'll end up killing everybody who agrees with you. You know, it doesn't make sense.
So I have a question for you. I confess that I have read none of your books, largely because my dance card is so filled with books from 55 years ago that I rarely have time between my own writing and that. So there's not a patch on you, and I will take small comfort in the fact that you probably have not read mine.
Can I ask you one question?
Please.
Why 55 years? What was it about the number 55?
So 55 is kind of a magical number. I just got asked that today, and the glib answer is 50 years is too short and 60 years is too long. But the real answer is 55 years is magical in terms of recognizing our world in the past. It is our world just a little crappier, but the fashions, the music, the concerns of the day are eerily paralleled today. And I find more and more resonances as I go along.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, because obviously if I wrote Galactic Journey simply as a historical thing, it would be interesting, but mostly for archivists and so forth. Yeah. Galactic Journey is really shining a light on today through the relevance of yesterday. And 55 years has seemed to be the best way to do it. Up to and including the third debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton took place on the exact same day, 55 years after the third debate of John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. When you write your science fiction, how much are you trying to, how important is it that the science is there to be interesting and fundamental to the story, as opposed to how much are you trying to say something with it? How are you being predictive or cautionary with your incorporation of science fiction in your stories?
That's hard for me to answer. You know, I just started writing stories, and to me, they were about the characters. I didn't realize how much science I was putting in, you know, especially when I first started. I took for granted people knew a lot more than later my readers would say, well, I didn't even understand this word, let alone what you're trying to say. But when I sent it to the first person who expressed interest in publishing me was David Hartwell, who's a very good editor. And he liked hard SF. You know, we had very different views about certain aspects of hard SF. But, he liked what I wrote. And he said, we're looking for people who write hard SF. And I didn't know what he meant at first. I said, well, what does that mean? He said, science-based science fiction. You have all that science in your book. And I said, I do. I didn't know I was putting it in. I'm a scientist and I wrote it. And because I was trained, in theoretical physics and doing research and stuff, I researched it because that's what I learned. That's what I knew. And then it turns out there's a whole field, of this stuff, and people are looking for it. And then he said, talk more about the science. So then I did exposition. This is where Star Trek would go, dun, da, da. If you're going to do exposition, science exposition in a book, it's an art, and you have to do it well because otherwise it bores your readers. So I had to learn how to do exposition.
Right.
And it didn't, he so much liked it. He would encourage me to do a lot of it. And of course, I liked doing it because I liked it. But then, I started getting things from readers said, I loved your book and I loved the characters and I loved the character development, but I just skipped those paragraphs about how the starship engine worked.
Well, from your point of view, it's fundamentals, right? You don't want to, as a writer, I hate the idea of any inconsistency or inaccuracy in my book. And so there is so much behind the scenes that nobody notices. And yet it's really important that I get everything exactly right. And part of it's just because I love to teach. And so I love backdoor sliding teaching into it. And I imagine there's some of that with you too.
Well, we do this much research, right? And this much makes it into the book.
Right. And pages of exposition get trimmed out and get replaced with a line.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the hard part.
That's not just the science, I've got all the stuff background about my characters. I mean, the science is interesting, but the book's not interesting unless I care about what happens to the characters. It's really about them. And
sure.
How they use the science and how the science affects them, sure. But the story is about characters.
So it's interesting you bring that up. So one of the things that is happening 55 years ago is the fact that we have something called soft science fiction. That's a word that has not really come into vogue yet, but will very shortly. Hard science fiction exists as a concept, but the idea of let's focus not just on these technical problems that need to be solved, or having a gotcha at the end of the story. Let's actually explore the human condition with a science fiction-y backdrop.
Yeah.
That is just starting to happen now, this so-called new wave of science fiction that started in the UK and is diffusing into the United States with people like John Brunner and Brian Aldiss and J.G. Ballard, Harry Harrison.
I think it was always there. It was just nowhere near as much. They brought it to the forefront.
Right. There was a bit in the 50s, a lot of women were writing interesting, not the straight stuff, the astounding style, John Campbell type science fiction. But it was really a big sort of jump. Go ahead.
The problem 55 years ago, I mean, Campbell's legacy is huge on this field, but I'm not sure it's the best. There are really two definitions of hard SF, science-based SF. And one is just what I would call the standard definition, which is science fiction based solidly in science with extrapolations. And then there's what is called, David Hartwell called Campbellian, I don't know how you pronounce it, hard SF. And it's got a specific political voice, like Ayn Rand, it's got that kind of voice. You have to write a certain way. It's mostly white people. It's mostly white men. It's historically, it's a very specific voice and approach and politics. And although I think that's interesting from a historical point of view, I don't think that should be defined as hard SF. It's its own genre, if that makes sense. It's a genre that accepts a story like The Cold Equations, which is laughably bad science.
Well, we can spend a lot of time talking about the failings.
Yeah, I know.
Well, and John Campbell's such an interesting paradox, right? I mean, in many ways, he ushers in the golden age of science fiction in the 40s, and kudos to him. And he discovered a lot of great authors, and Astounding was in many ways a fine book. But then he also bought into the stupidest pseudoscience, from Dianetics to the Dean Drive to dowsing. I mean,
Did he really? I didn't know he bought into that. Yeah, there are a lot of people. Dianetics, I think Hubbard started that as a, I don't think he actually believed it. I think he wanted to start a church. I forget the reason why, but I don't think he himself actually, well, maybe not. I
L.
should,
Ron Hubbard may have done things completely cynically, but I'm pretty convinced that John Campbell went into the stuff that he bought into. Although he later distanced himself somewhat from Dianetics, and of course he had, I would say, beyond the bell curve racist attitudes.
yeah,
Although not,
yeah.
although his
Misogynist.
um, it's an important distinction I would make. John Campbell probably was not particularly more misogynist than the mainstream males in the mid 1960s, from what I understand. In fact, I just covered an issue where we're not talking about science, but I just covered an issue where Carol E. Scott, who's now a retired doctor in economics, she had submitted a story to Astounding because she happened to love that magazine the most, and she got published with a story that was completely non-Campbellian in its nature, and she was demonstrably a woman just from her name. And as far as I know, she just got published off the slush pile, no issue. So, and Astounding, for whatever issues it had, did not publish markedly fewer women than any other magazine in the market at the time. Although F&SF tended to be a better representation of women than any other magazine at the time.
I think the thing about Campbell is he was more verbal about it. For me, going back 55 years is actually painful because back then I loved science fiction and none of it was written with girls in mind. When I was a child, I wanted to read about the girls having adventures. I wanted them to go out and save the universe and win the male hero, and rescue him, the hunk in distress.
55 years ago, that is just starting to happen.
And it simply did not exist. And now I have this big flowering. We talked about this a lot more in the diversity panel. This is not so much the place, but I am encouraged by this big flowering of, books, movies, TV shows. You look at like The Expanse you're talking about. That's got a lot of strong female characters. 55 years ago, you wouldn't have seen any of them. If you saw any strong female character, she was probably a villain.
So 55 years ago is interesting for that because you start getting Samuel R. Delany. So Babel 17 stars Rydra Wong. Sybil Sue Blue stars Sybil Sue Blue.
Babylon 5 was not 55 years ago.
No. Babel 17. Babel 17.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if I said Babylon 5, but I meant Babel 17. You're just starting to get it. I actually publish a series called Rediscovery Science Fiction by Women, and you're right. In a first order approximation, women are highly underrepresented in the time. But there actually was a pretty strong 10 to 15% of science fiction was written by women, and often would star women, but not always. Often women would write men. So it was there, but you're right. It was definitely in the background.
You make a good point, which is the seeds of the flowering we're seeing now, it was always there. I think more for women than for racial minorities.
Yes.
But strong, I once saw this wonderful post and it said, who are the most famous women in popular culture? This was like maybe, 5-10 years ago. And who are the most famous women in science fiction stories, movies, stuff. And for popular culture, it had like Kim Kardashian and, people like that. Miley Cyrus, I think, was one of them. And then for the science fiction, it was like, Captain Ivana, what's the one on Babylon 5? Ivanova. And from the one from Stargate. And now I'm drawing a blank on her. What was her name? She was really, really good. The Stargate. She's a famous character, and I'm still.
That's a show I never saw.
Are you talking about Catherine? I think the characters. Yeah, Major Carter, Catherine Carter.
Whoever it was, yeah. In Stargate, she was played by the same person, the same actress. My daughter has a picture signed by this actress in the other room, and I'm just so dense today. I'm drawing a blank. The same one who starred in. Oh man, these are all just slipping my mind. But they were all captains. They were all kick butt heroes. They were all, people that were, highly trained, highly experienced. And that was what was in science fiction. So the seeds were always there, and now we're seeing them come to fruit. And if you look at regular literature, what seeds are there for women's development? Anna Karenina, she dies, she's punished for being sexual.
The Cage was remarkable in that it had a woman first officer, which we wouldn't get a woman first officer in the American Navy until the mid 80s, late 80s. There were 3 women on the bridge at one point. That sort of casual equality of genders was just absolutely remarkable. And I like to think that Star Trek is one of the main reasons women ended up in science fiction in a big way. There's this watershed in the late 60s, and all of a sudden women are really into science, are contributing in science fiction. They were always there as fans and readers.
Yeah.
But we should probably talk about science.
Yeah, one more thing though. Someone just put it in I just looked at the comments. Amanda Tapping, that was who I was trying to, she plays wonderful roles. But anyway, yeah, so we should go back to science.
One person once said that one thing they liked about my books was that I take into account logistics, fuel, maintenance, licensing, things like that, things that tend to be glossed over in science fiction. How much do you pay attention to the nuts and bolts of things when you're doing your writing?
Oh, all of it. I mean, because you're making a world. Worlds or a universe, civilizations have economies, right? How does the economy work? Civilizations have universities, they have hospitals, they have people who do the maintenance work, people who do dock work in the starports. It's got to have all that stuff or it's not interesting. If you just talk about, they have a military fleet and they go and have these exciting space battles, it's kind of limiting the milieu, and I think people get into it more when they feel like they can dig their teeth into this world, and that the people have backgrounds, characters have backgrounds that fit into different places in the world building. And world building is really science when you think about it. If you're building a world, like for example, supposing you have an insect and it has supposing you have something you ride and it has 6 legs. Well, you're not just going to have one animal with 6 legs. You have to think about the scientific implications of that. Probably most of the fauna, most of the animals on this world are going to have 6 legs then. The more mammalian animals, or are they mammalian? It's not just going to be one thing. It's not going to just be trees with blue fruit and everything else is like Earth. You have to think through the science. What causes it to be a different color, and how would that affect the rest of the biosphere? And that becomes a fascinating game. Once you make a change, you say, how would this affect the rest of it? And it's really fun.
What I find interesting is the relation between science fiction trends and science. So in the 40s and to some degree the 50s, it was all about going to other planets in the solar system.
Yeah.
And as soon as we started sending probes into orbit and to the other planets, as soon as science fiction was suddenly on the front page, science moved on to the stars. And you had talked about how it takes 40 years before your science is dated, and now it's 40 seconds. So I guess the question is, these days, where does science fiction tend to be? Is it far out in space? Is it dystopian after the fall in the world? Where do you think it is right now?
Yes, to what you just said. It's all over the place. I think science fiction is a much bigger field now. What we call science fiction, people used to call science fiction and fantasy, and now they've gotten so big. I mean, Game of Thrones is its own, universe. That and the Game of Thrones universe is probably bigger than all of science fiction and fantasy was, back in, historical, more than 55 years ago.
You mean in terms of fandom and
yeah, and just, books and programs and things written about it. It's much, much bigger now. The majority of the best attended best-selling movies are all science fiction or fantasy. I mean, it's kind of hard to draw a distinction.
Marvel unit movies definitely are kind of in there.
Yeah. One of the things, I do this science and science fiction talk, And I talk about science and where it's good and where it's bad in various media. And one of the things I love doing is I really like the Wonder Woman movie, right? And I tell my audience, I say, okay, one of Wonder Woman's powers is defying the laws of physics. And I show them that absolutely wonderful scene where she walks across no man's land. She just walks across it. And it's one of the most exciting scenes in the movie. And I say, how many ways can you come up with her violating physics in this scene? And people really pick up on that. I mean, it's a lot of fun, how she jumps. She has these really high jumps that she doesn't, to propel yourself up that high, the human body can't do it, right? Unless unless that's your superpower, right? But also smaller things like how the bullets ricochet off her gauntlet and her shield is actually done with the correct geometry. But then there's other stuff that doesn't make sense, like why do they blow up when they hit the ground, but not her shield, that kind of thing.
Well, speaking of jumping, the Hulk, if he's able to bound a mile into the air, what should really happen is he should push down with his feet and then just make giant divots into the earth and not go anywhere.
Yes, exactly. He seems to get bigger too, depending on what the plot requires.
Well, if you make him angry, he gets bigger. So,
yeah.
So here's a question. Science fantasy is probably bigger than science and probably always has been. And when I talk about that, I mean something like Star Wars, which has spaceships and stars and planets, but is not science fiction, is fantasy with science fiction trappings. How do you feel about that? Do you think that,
I love that. To me, it was all science fiction. When I remember, now I'm really going to date myself here. But when Star Wars first one came out, I was in college and my boyfriend and I went to see it. And it was really long line. We were in Westwood and this line went on forever. We had to wait in line for like 1 or 2 hours because you had to go to the movie theater in those days. And, after a while we got tired and we started having an argument, right? Because we were college students, cranky and hungry and stuck in this line. And so we were kind of, bickering a little, and we go in the theater and we sit down and we're still going da 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 da. And then it goes, how the beginning goes, or dun dun dun, and it shows that big thing going out. It just shut us up. I swear, we were like mesmerized. And we were totally captivated the whole time. And I don't think he was even a big science fiction person. But to me, this was like, oh, finally, good science fiction. I didn't think of it as science fantasy at the time. I just thought, oh, they got spaceships, they got, queens and kings or whatever it was. I forget. Leia was a queen or princess?
Princess, yeah.
It was just fun.
I'm much older than you. I was born in 1920, and so I'm a curmudgeon. Yeah. And I have to say, for instance, for me, the beginning of the end of the Star Trek franchise was Star Trek II, because before that, combat would happen at multiple times the speed of light. Battle would happen at a range of hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And suddenly in Star Trek II, we had World War I battle cruisers moving at about 10 miles an hour, getting within about 100 feet. And I'm surprised grappling hooks didn't go between ships. And now that's everything. And I think in some ways Star Wars is to blame for that, right? Because they translated World War I and World War II movies into very, very attractive special effects, but utterly nonsensical situations.
Yeah, things like, using World War I air fight principles or ideas in space doesn't make sense. Like if you're in an atmosphere getting above the plane that you're trying to shoot makes sense, right? Because you have gravity on your side. In space, it's completely different. And also on a planet, fights are essentially two-dimensional. I mean, you can go up and down in the sky. But in space, especially deep space, they're completely three-dimensional, four-dimensional if you count time, and often taking place at relativistic speeds, or at least speeds that affect how time dilation and, rotation or contraction, whatever's happening, how that affects how the ships interact with it, how the weapons interact. I mean, all that stuff doesn't happen in battles on a planet. And I don't think I notice it more actually in Star Wars. When I finally started paying attention, I couldn't go on being oblivious and just loving, sheer joy at seeing it. My mind finally said, no, wait a minute.
Bridge moment. The thing is, what I find so interesting is war is really uninteresting these days. War in the 21st, I mean, it's either horrifying for the people suffering through it or completely invisible to the rest of us, especially now that we are entering a period of drone-launched quasi-war that isn't even launched, usually secret. It is over the horizon. And yet, in all of our movies, combat is still hand-to-hand or World War I rifle-ish or World War I fighter-ish, because that's what we grew up with, and that's what the movies keep perpetuating. I find it so interesting that science fiction does not seem to have caught up, certainly not in the movies. I can't speak
That's
to
more the
literature.
movies. It's not in books. I mean, all my battle scenes are worked out with all these advanced. But I'm more interested in how it affects the people. I mean, I'm told I write very good military SF because I work out all the numbers and all the stuff for, how many joules this does and all that kind of stuff, and how, the three-dimensional or four-dimensional field of battle. But to me, the battle is as much about how it affects human nature or human conditions as the battle itself. And I think that's what's movies like Star Wars and Star Trek, even though you're wondering where the heck, how can they be traveling around the galaxy and still have this 1950s technology, and how they fight. But I think they're concentrating on how it affects the emotions of the people watching it. And I suspect the writers believe that if they made it too futuristic, it wouldn't engage.
I feel like that's a cop out. I feel like a good writer can make
Well,
any.
that was my next statement. I think they underestimate their viewers, or maybe they just can't perceive it. I don't know. I don't know the answer to
I
that.
think most people just aren't trained enough in science and being good writers to be able to fuse the two. And I think something like The Expanse is lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, yeah, they try.
So
But
deep.
some things are obvious. Like, okay, I really enjoyed, okay, the last Rin. What was the name of that one? That Star Wars, where Rin was the person. I can't remember. It was one of the more
It's
later
the last
ones.
trilogy, yes.
Yeah, and there's a scene where they sneak aboard the enemy, this huge enemy space station, battle cruiser, whatever it was, and nobody knows they're there. These battle cruisers have this incredible ability to destroy entire planets, right? They can blow them up from other star systems. That takes an incredible.
But they don't have CCTV. Well, that's because of First Amendment or Fourth Amendment privacy rights. The Imperium is very strong in guarding your right to privacy, and so there are no security cameras on Imperial starships. I think that's very progressive of them.
Be something on the securities going beep beep beep. I don't recognize these life signs, or at least they should have something like they have a shroud or jammer that protects them from that.
Imperial citizens have their rights.
You can do that.
Next, you're going to ask them to wear masks.
But we can do that now. Our modern day science could do more than what the huge battle cruiser in Star Wars was doing. And that was really annoying.
But that's always been the problem with science fantasy. And that's one of the things that always pained me about where Disneyland and Disney World went. So when Disneyland first came out, they had a Tomorrowland, and they actually speculated on what the world of tomorrow would be. And then about 30 years ago, they changed their focus to basically Yesterdayland. And
Really?
they just sort of, oh yeah, well, if you go to Tomorrowland today, it's all either Star Wars or sort of these Victorian ideas of what the future would be like. We've basically decided that there is no tomorrow, and we're not interested in it as a land for Disneyland. It was very disappointing.
Do you think it's because the future is developing so fast that what Tomorrowland actually might be projected to be would be inaccessible to the average family, the average child, because it would be so different?
Maybe. I think it's also the rise of science fantasy being what people are interested in. So people go to a park to spend money because they're interested in properties they know and think are cool. In the 60s, there weren't any except technology and whatever they made, adventure through inner space and flight to the moon and so forth. Now we have Star Wars and Buzz Lightyear and other properties that are space-y, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And so Disney just sort of latches onto these things they know are money makers. And especially that's significant because in the 90s, the parks were losing money. So they went for whatever was certain to make them money.
Right, yeah.
By the way, so
I have to admit, I like that stuff. I mean, I get annoyed at the science, but they're good. The stories, they tell good stories. And in my
You're still
experience,
young.
what?
You're still young.
I'm older than you are.
The heck you said.
Oh, I forget. You were born in the 1920s. That's right.
That's right. I'm ancient. Dee asks about Stargate and the science therein. I have never seen Stargate.
Oh.
So go ahead.
My husband, I was asked to write an essay for a Stargate anthology about what science could actually make Stargate work. So I started working on it, and I couldn't get anywhere. So I went to my husband. He passed away a few years ago, but before that, he was a NASA scientist, and he did LIGO and black holes. And I said, well, I'm trying to make this Stargate thing work, and I can't. And so we worked together for, I don't know, almost a month, or certainly 3 weeks or so, trying to find a way. And he'd try all these different things. He said, well, let's try exotic matter. And then he'd go, no, that's not going to work. And we just couldn't find a way to make it work. And by that time, our essay was getting too technical, too scientific for, a Stargate anthology. So basically we said, all right, let's just talk about some of the ideas. And then at the end I said, and while at the moment we can't see with what we currently have doing this, you always know you can, into the future, we're going to find new things. And I kind of just left it at that, because we couldn't find a way to actually scientifically extrapolate known theories to make the Stargate work. I was very mad at myself for not being able to do that.
I give talks all the time about space history and so forth. And one of the questions I get is, when do you think we're going to go into space in a big way? And I've always said, look, I hate to be doom and gloom, but with the current paradigm of taking a cylinder and throwing mass out the back of it, I don't think it's economically going to happen, Elon Musk's promises notwithstanding. I would love to be proven wrong, but that's currently my feeling. That doesn't mean I don't think we're never going to go to space. I think we're going to end up sometime in the next 50 to 100 years, like you say, some development we haven't even foreseen will come and suddenly space will be economical. But you really have to go, I really don't know what it is, so I just have to say it happened.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's like what happened with computers. When I first started writing my first book, I had this, this web that went all over the place. And people would say, that's not realistic. It's not realistic that an information web would be so permeated in people's lives. But the thing that happened was computers and the development of, computers, and from there, the associated technology happened quickly. It happened, the science and the technology developed quickly enough that people were able to make it economically, commercially successful. The minute they had that, and the minute they could do it for commercially reasonable prices, so lots of people could buy it, the technology took off, because then it wasn't only we know how to do this, it was we know how to make money off of this. And so right. We saw this huge explosion of information technology, computers, and now it permeates everything. My computer died last night. I mean, it crashed, and my whole life was upended. Everything, I couldn't get on email. I couldn't do anything because I didn't have access to the information universe. I think someday that's going to happen with getting off the planet. It just, we can't see it yet. And I don't think we could see the information technology explosion before it came. We had guesses.
Right. But clearly. We have time for one more question. And that question was, how do you avoid info dumps when putting science in your science fiction? You've talked a little bit about that, but go ahead and tell us a little about your process.
Oh, well, I had quite a few info dumps. I had my second book was Catch the Lightning, and it goes along a real fast pace, and they're escaping from Earth and all this stuff, and they're off in the space station. And then I hit this point in the middle of all this action, I had this big info dump about how it all worked. And it was like the plot came to a screaming halt. Right? It actually wasn't as bad as what I just described. When I went back to rewrite it a few years ago after I got the rights back, I realized I hadn't done as bad as I perceived. But it had been too much of, like you say, info dump. And the fact that it interested me, that it fascinated me, all this genetics and starship stuff, I had to find a way to engage the reader. And I think writing scientific exposition is a skill. It takes a lot of practice. You have to, like now I try to weave it more into the story as it goes along. The character has a reason to know this. And I just happened on that in my first book because I was explaining all the science of how these weapons and various drives worked in the middle of a battle where the character doing it was going to die if she didn't figure out how to use her weapons properly. And so, you know, that gave me a way to describe the science that I was using without having it dumped. Of course, there are other places in that book where it is dumped.
Well, the short answer is judicious editing, right? Because
yeah,
I write Wikipedia articles actually, and you'll never know because it's anonymous, but I'm responsible for a lot of the pretty good content in the early space flight on Wikipedia. And there is an art to writing a lot of stuff in very short. I remember agonizing over one paragraph in my first novel because I had to explain acceleration and turnover of a ship. But I'm writing a YA, so I can't be very technical. And anyway, who wants to read all this crap? So I remember I boiled it down to like 2 lines, and I was so proud of it. I had that in my latest book too, where it's like, there are scientific concepts that must be explained. I was describing radio velocity curves when you're finding planets around other stars.
oh, yeah.
And why that's important. It's not just, oh, turn on your sensor and see a star. I mean, you could say that, but 1, the science is cool. 2, if you can say it in a sentence, you might as well. And 3, it explains the limitations of the universe. And 4 is interesting world building. This is how they do it.
Yeah.
But to write a sentence about radio velocity in a YA science fiction book and do it quickly was a challenge, which I hope I successfully did.
That's always a challenge of writing YA is you can't use your entire vocabulary.
Right.
Because you're writing, you know, it's ironic, but if you use a vocabulary that you would use with college students, you frustrate your readers. I mean, some of them actually may know that vocabulary anyway. Some of these young kids are quite well read. But there's limitations on how you do exactly what you did. And if you can do that, if you can find a sentence, if you can find a way to work it in, that's a really valuable talent.
Well, and my long story short answer is I'm lucky enough to have a reasonably bright but quite young child. She's 17 now. And so I throw things past her. And if she enjoys it, then I know I'm probably decent for YA.
I would let my daughter read my stuff. My stuff had a lot of sex in it. And one day she came to me and said, I read your book. I read The Radiant Seas. And I was like, oh, God.
How old is she now?
She's 31 now.
Next year, you'll let her.
Yeah, no, she read it when she was like, oh, I don't remember how old she was. 12.
Oh,
she
wow.
came to me, she goes, Mom, where do you get all those ideas about the, you know, the stuff that minute?
I've passed puberty.
I go, you know, she goes, do you and Dad do? I was like, what do you do when you're completely unprepared and your daughter comes in and says, well, is this true? You know,
we have never had sex, my child. That has never happened.
Yeah, that was embarrassing. I said, you can't read any more of my books till you're 41. But she's
I hate to say this, but we are out of time. I have had a tremendous time meeting you and talking to you, and
yeah, you do a great job moderating.
I hope everyone had fun being here. And Catherine, if you don't mind, I'm going to send you a Discord after this and invite you to the fun stuff we do.
Oh, I have a reading right away, but let's put our websites in the chat if people want to visit. I'm CatharineAsaro.com, and then if you want to save me from having to get a job as a waitress, so I can work, you can go to my Patreon page.
I can send you guys as each other's emails as well. So like Hal did for you the other night.
Oh yeah, that was great. I finally got on to my main email account, so I am getting them there too.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I got to sit in on one of your panels. Yay.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was fun. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.